Alright, today in the shop we're moving forward with the El Camino project, and I actually have the engine and transmission mounted into the chassis here. That's a GM LT4, which is the supercharged engine, pretty nice piece of equipment, with the 10-speed GM transmissions. That's a 10L90 there. Now, El Caminos, they came with typically turbo 350s, turbo 400s, which were 3-speed transmissions. And that transmission tunnel will not be adequately sized for that huge transmission. Now, if you're doing an 8L90 or 8-speed GM transmission, that's the same housing as the 10-speed. So we're basically looking at the same job to do that. But what we're going to do today is we're going to expand that tunnel there to allow for that extra spacing. Even have to clearance the firewall a little bit because there is a fuel pump that goes onto the back of the LT4, which takes up a little extra real estate. But in any case, what we'll do is we'll kind of roll the chassis underneath it. We'll be able to get some general dimensions in terms of front to back, and then some widths, and then we'll start trimming away. Now, important to note, I already have this and I've gone through this before, but on the inner portion of the car, as you're cutting away pieces that are structural, like the floor, you need to support the car. So I have these two here. I may actually even put one side to side there in the front just to bolster that a little bit, because you do not want the dimensions of your vehicle to change as you start to take structure away. So make sure that you got angles in there and that everything is well supported. Now, if you're on the chassis, it's not as big of a deal, but this would be a sort of a little bit more challenging to do if you were. All right, so I'll show you what I think is an adequate amount of support to cut out the floor. So I have a brace kind of going that way, an angle, and then when I kind of up the side here, even attached to the steering column support there, just in case I end up cutting away some more of that firewall. It'll help keep that still structural. Now, your welds don't need to be pretty, but do keep in mind a little bit of strategies just so they're easier to get to with a cutoff wheel later when you're going to remove those pieces, and you don't need to be fancy. Here's where we're at. I used this front mount as a reference point and then made kind of a scale here all the way back to the end of the transmission there. And then I used tape measure to just give me some preliminary dimensions, so that way I'd have a general idea of what to cut out. And then I can more easily do that with it on the rotisserie, and what I have in mind is a cut kind of like that. Now, it looks like the width is actually pretty decent for the transmission tunnel. It's more the height that I'm going to have to modify. And one thing I could do is I actually could cut that off and add a filler panel in just to kind of raise it up. I probably won't do that, just so I can kind of fabricate a piece just to kind of make it a little more unique, and also give me a better spot to mount my shifter on, as this car came with a column shifter from the factory. But in any case, I'm going to get my grinder with a cutoff wheel. You could use a plasma cutter or whatever else you want to use, to body saw, sawzall, whatever. Just use what you have. I'll continue to mark that. I'll cut this edge. I'll rotate my rotisserie, get the other end, and I'll get that out. And then I'll be able to fit the body onto the chassis, kind of see where we're at. There is also a chance I'll have to continue down the tunnel for the drive shaft, because the angle of the drive shaft might be such that it is interfering with the tunnel as well. So we'll kind of see where we're at once everything's in place. All right, so let me show where we're at here in terms of planning and decision making, etc. So I'd actually decided I'm going to use the original equipment tunnel. Part of the reason I did that is because in order to hug the transmission relatively closely and to make up for the gap that's cut out in there, it'd be a relatively complex shape. That's not just like actually replacing this part where it's really just a cylindrical replacement. It's a conical shape, which is much more complex to fabricate. Not to say it can't be done, but why recreate the wheel here? So we actually have this piece here, which is going to work pretty well. Now, part of the reason I think it's going to work pretty well is because I actually didn't have to expand the tunnel a whole lot beyond original equipment. In fact, up top there towards the bell housing region, that actually is pretty close. Like it might even work without much modification. But as you get back towards the rear of the transmission, then it gets a little too bulky. So really, if I could take that original equipment and just raise it up a few inches, I think that actually would work pretty well. Now, I did use a little string there to help recreate kind of the trajectory of the drive shaft. So I think I am going to have to modify this brace here a little bit, which is fine. But then once you get back towards this part, it actually works okay. And I don't have to actually account for much movement of the drive shaft in this situation because this is independent rear suspension, which means that the rear center section stays fixed, so it doesn't move up and down like it would if there was suspension, non-independent rear suspension, like a 4-link or something else. Now I also went ahead and figured I wanted about a little more than an inch of clearance. You could go with less, but just in case I move things around a little bit or whatever, that's what I figured was a good amount. So I took a 2x4, which is 1.5 inches thick. I just modified it a little bit, give me about a 1.25 inches of clearance there. And then if I actually move this forward just a bit, you can see it gives me pretty even gap along there, and then it just moves up like that. So basically I just going to make a template to fill in this gap here. Now, as mentioned earlier, I probably actually flange this so that way I can attach it with some bolts and make it so it's removable later in case I got to access the transmission for removal, etc. So that might be one little extra thing I will do. In fact, probably doing that. In any case, let's get going towards the templates. So this is a template for the driver's side, and this is the one for the passenger side. And because this isn't a straight line, I measured distances every so often so you can get sort of a curve. The more of those you have, the more closely you'll represent the curve on this side. And I decided to do 3.25 inches. Reason is I want to raise it up, the tunnel up 2.5 inches, and I wanted to account for a 3/4 inch flange to help mate to that transmission tunnel. Okay. So I can remove it later. In any case, now I can go ahead and trace that, cut it out, and then we can transfer these templates to our metal and then get those affixed to the vehicle. All right, so in preparation to flange the edge of this here to be able to set it flush for mounting and removal, I'm actually going to just trim that off. I'll use a grinder with a cutoff wheel like that. All right, so I spent a bit of time making my templates, and even though these are pretty simple templates, I do recommend really focusing on that as an important step because that'll save you time in the end and save you material. And I've heard a lot of other people much more talented than myself recommend that as well. In any case, now I'm all traced out here, ready to cut this out. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can use a grinding wheel or cutoff wheel. You can use a nibbler. I think this is just 20 gauge, so it's not very thick. So just a hand shear should do actually a pretty good job with minimal waste and get us nice edges. I got those pieces all cut out and they turned out really well. The shear gives you a really pretty good control with 20 gauge. You can get around those edges pretty well. But the one downside you'll notice, there can be a little distortion there. That's not a big deal though, because I can just use a hammer or anvil or flat surface and just get that back flat again, because really any other tool has some pros and some cons. But in any case, ready to move on to the next step and getting those other panels prepped and ready to get these tacked into place. All right, let me show you where we're at. So I did the passenger side panel here, and I'll show the details of what to do, how I did it on the driver's side, but just kind of as proof of concept so I could see how this is going to turn out. This is that side. So I did use a bead roller to do a 1/4 inch rounded bead like that. And that gives the panel a little bit extra structure, but also kind of a unique appearance as well. The reason I want to do that, because if I'm going to bolt that upper tunnel to this, meaning have it removable, I just wanted a little extra rigidity in this panel. So I first put a little curve in the panel with my roller, although I did also kind of form it around something hard and round like that. And then I put the bead in there. And then I also used the bead roller to make this kind of bend here so that flange can sit on there nice and flush. Now, so I didn't follow my pattern exactly because I couldn't make that bend any more tightly, but it ended up turning out pretty good. So each side is symmetric. I just took the template and overlaid it like that, and then used the end of a Sharpie like this to just sort of depress within that groove. So now I can cut that out and I can have a really symmetric shape on, so it matches the other side. But let's see what this looks like in here. And I did spend a bit of time making sure that the bottom would match up pretty well, but you can see how that flange mates up there really pretty well. It's not lined up perfectly right now because I'm holding it with one hand, but the angle is pretty decent there, and I think it's going to end up looking pretty good. All right, so I've spent quite a bit of time making sure that this panel fits up really pretty well. And you can see it does. Even with a good template, you still have some imperfections that you got to work through. Now, a little bit of gap isn't the worst, but if you have too big of a gap, you're going to be adding additional material, additional heat, so it's going to make it more challenging to have good end product. So that actually looks pretty decent like that. And I've gone ahead and cleaned up the E-coating with just a flap disc like that. And then I'll be able to tack that in place once we get the bead in there and get that edge kind of flanged a little bit. Okay? All right, so next step is to transfer this pattern for the bead onto this one here. So as mentioned, I just used a little marker to depress. You can use your finger or whatever you want to use just to be able to get that. And then I'll cut that shape out, and then I'll transpose it onto here. And then I'll roll this to give a little bit of a curve so it matches the original. And then I'll show how I use the, actually these, so let me show you the dies here. So this is the 1/4 inch bead that I'm using. So there's the female and then the male. And then to make that little bend for the flange, I just use this. It puts just a mark on there, and then you can just add a little bit of pressure to the panel to bend that edge up a little bit so it matches real well with where the tunnel is going to come down on it. Okay? All right, so now the next step is to put a little curve in it. You can see how it's just a gentle curve. Doesn't have to be a lot. It's just to kind of match the contour so the panel lines up with the tunnel. And there are a few ways to do this. This is 20 gauge. So 20 gauge will bend with just pressure from your hands. So you start getting 18 gauge or thicker. That's much harder. But you can just use a form like this. These are from Eastwood, but honestly just a pipe with a fairly sharp diameter, like 1 inch to 1.5 will give you something to kind of push on so you can round that out. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a roll like this, that works really great. This system here from Northern has a shear brake and the roll. Granted, I don't use the shear and the brake anymore because I have much nicer ones here. But this is a decent piece of equipment with everything all in one. But basically what the roll does, I put that in there, I place pressure on this upper one, and you can place different pressure on one side versus the other if you want it to be conical. If you want it to be cylindrical or an even curve all the way around, then you put even pressure on both sides. And then that pushes down on this roll here between these other two bottom ones, and then that will bend this concave. So the curve will be such that if I want to make this end concave, this end convex, so convex down, concave up. Okay. All right, so now I got a gentle curve in there, and what I have to do is I have to actually make a little flange here, bend that back the other direction, so that way it matches up with the top portion of the tunnel. In order to do that, I'm actually going to use these dies here. It looks very sharp, but it won't cut anything. It just puts a little bit of pressure there to be able to make a bend. There's other ways to bend this. But that said, it's not a straight line where I can just use the brake. It's a complex, it's curved like that. So using something like this works really well, but you could just use a vise or, vise grips and just keep kind of bending along there. That would work fine. This will give it a little more gentle and even or uniform bend to it. So now when I put it on there, as this top die places pressure down on the flat one, it'll bend it concave up, or convex down. So since I want to go the other direction, I want the back side of this panel to be concave. I flipped it over. So I marked that red line there as a 3/4 inch to match up with the 3/4 inch flange on the tunnel, and then I'll just bend that gently back. Now, as you do this, it will just bend a little bit just by placing pressure on there, and the more pressure you place, the more it'll bend it, but it's sort of a gentle bend. If you want, you can actually place just a little bit of pressure on this panel as you do it, so kind of exaggerating that force to bend it a little bit more, okay? All right, so that looks pretty good. Now it's not perfectly uniform there yet. Just a pinch of irregularity, and I did get off course just a little bit right there, but that's no problem. I'll just take this to, flat surface, this anvil, and then use my hammer there just to kind of even that all out, make it a nice uniform bend. All right, so now you can see that shape I'm going for. It's got that curve like that, and then just straightens out there. And with the hammer and anvil, it's quite uniform. I have a tapering, just a little less of a bend up here, just because that's the way the tunnel is. And then the next step, I'll follow my red mark here and make that bead, 1/4 inch bead. And then we'll be able to get this tacked in place. All right, so I rolled that bead and it looked pretty decent, but I actually didn't like the way this curve turned out. You can kind of see the outline there of where it used to be. So I just took the hammer and put it on an anvil and kind of flattened it back out, hit it with a flap disc, kind of smooth it, and we'll start again. And I'll make that curve just a little more gentle. I feel like it was just a little too abrupt there. Now, I mean, this is barely going to show when the car's together, but that said, I tried to do my best on everything. And also it's good policy just to try to make things look as nice as you can. So let's start that over. The next step is I'm going to get this one tacked into place. Now I'm going to do this side first because the other side I was having actually just a little more trouble mating this surface up with the edge of the tunnel because there's a little bit different curved on that side. But anyways, we'll proceed. All right, so that side's tacked in place, and now what I'm going to do is I'll actually clamp the upper panel of the tunnel to this so that way I can see how it's going to actually mate up on the other side before tacking that side in. So I got this side clamped up and it mates up really pretty well, and I'll come over to the other side and we'll kind of test fit this panel. I've done it a few times already and actually changed the angle on this just a little bit more. And once you got that little groove in there from that bead, then all I did was just go to the edge of the anvil with a hammer and just put the edge right in that seam of the anvil and then just pound on that. And that's one way to get that a little bit more of an angle. But you can see that's starting to mate up pretty decent at this point. So I think at this point I can get that tacked in and we can move from there. All right, so if you're doing a butt weld like this and you find you're midway along tacking something in place, you got a little bit of overlap where you can't get that butt weld quite right, you can take a grinder with a cutoff wheel and just sort of try to gently shave down one side there. Otherwise, it's fine to have a thin gap the width of a cutoff wheel and just sort of go in there and just grind right there. And then you'll be able to fix that overlap. You'll have a tiny gap, which is perfectly fine to fill. All right, so there the tunnel is, kind of mocked into place with that those lower panels tacked in and then clamped there. So I'm going to move to the front here. And what I have to do there is I have to try to mate the area here to the existing front portion. So I've gone ahead and marked that with a Sharpie, so when I remove that I can kind of see where that would be meeting up. And what I'll do, I'll put some relief cuts in here and then do that on this side and the opposite side, and then I'll be able to bend this whole section up so they meet. What that'll do, that'll leave a pie-shaped gap there, which I'll have to fill with additional metal. The other thing I'll do too is I'm going to shave that entire pinch weld all the way across there on the opposite side. I'll show you what it looks like from the factory. That'll clean up the firewall a bit, also allowing for a little more clearance. But you can see this pinch weld runs all the way across. What that does, that fastens basically the firewall to the floor pan. And you can see how you get a little extra clearance under there because there is that pinch weld that continues even underneath there. Okay, so we'll get moving forward with that. Once I have that, then I can kind of recreate this back portion of the tunnel there to meet up here. We'll have to kind of recreate that structural component there, but we should be getting this into shape pretty quickly. Alright, so here's with the top part of the tunnel off, and what I'm going to do is end up cutting here, but also end up getting rid of that pinch weld, like I said. Now, one thing I want to point out, it's not a good assumption to think that everything is symmetric, even though the outside of the car typically is. Floor pan, especially in this case, is not. You can see how close that clearance is there to the point where there's not much right here, a quarter-ish inch. But on the opposite side, there's tons of clearance over there. So don't, if you're making templates or panels or whatever, just make sure you recognize this stuff is not all symmetric, okay? All right, so I'll get my cutoff wheel, kind of cut up that way. We'll cut along here. Try to be very careful not to get into my transmission. And then we'll see how easily that bends and reshapes. Alright, so now I got this panel so it's mobile and I can move it around as I need to. You can see I had to make a few extra cuts. I made one up here where it bulges out just a little bit, and then kind of one up the middle. As mentioned in other videos, these complex shapes actually provide rigidity to the panel, so this curve makes it so that way it doesn't bend. Unlike it was just a flat panel, you could bend it very easily. But in any case, then once I get into the shape I want, I'll have these kind of pie-shaped reliefs there, which will have to be filled in, but that's no big deal. We'll make it work. All right, now you can see that that actually is fitting up pretty decent. It's not perfect, but one technique I like to employ when it's getting close but not quite there, I'll drill a couple holes and either use Clecos or some screws to help kind of draw those panels together. And then that'll really kind of close that gap, get us to see where we need to be in terms of modifying this. Now, it could also be that I got to change the angle just a little bit because you can see as this is drawn up there, they don't match quite at the same plane. So I could either bend this lip down a little bit or make a little bit of a convex shape here, a little bit of a bend there. So we'll see what it's like as I draw it closer with some screws. The screws may actually form it the way it needs to be anyways. Alright, so now we got that mocked into place pretty well, and I'm going to move on to the back section. But before doing that, because we're going to be cutting out this support structure here, we want to take a few baseline measurements and try to support that floor a little extra, just to be on the cautious side. So I put a few jack stands underneath there, firmly against the floor pan, and also took a few baseline measurements. I thought a good place to do that from was the transmission support to the floor, and then I just got a few different measurements on each side. That way I could kind of monitor if that is increasing or decreasing in size, and I can get back into the right spot once all this is going back together. Okay, so get some lines marked up here, start cutting a few things out, because we have a few goals here. One goal is to allow space for the transmission, because you need the physical space, but you also don't want it super tight against the transmission, because that can allow heat buildup, and you really do want some airflow past there. But you also don't want to encroach upon your space in the car. Keep in mind, gas pedal resides there. Get too far into here, it could impede where the seat can go. So you know, want to have enough space for the transmission, but also not getting too far into the driver's compartment. So we'll see where we get with all this, and it should turn out pretty well. All right, for the rest of the tunnel, let me kind of show you what I have in mind. So I like straight edges to sort of be able to envision what's going on, and kind of recreating the natural angle that's already there. And turns out it terminates really right about where I need it to in terms of clearance. And that'll give it a nice even transition to what I have existing there. It's just that I'm not entirely sure how much of this support I'm going to have to cut out and refabricate. But before I go ahead and do that, I'm going to just get a rough template in mind. So, I measured that. I'm going to allow for about a 1-inch overhang for the flange to mount to the removable portion. So that gives me about 22 inches. So I got my length of my piece there. And then these flexible rulers like this are really nice. And I can get an idea for the width by kind of going like that. Turns out I need about 20 inches wide there. Now I won't need that same width the entire way, because once it's just here, all that is for the drive shaft, my drive shaft will be just a little more than 3 inches in diameter, but even big ones are only about 5 inches, so you don't need a ton of space there. You just have to allow for the straight portion between the from the transmission output shaft to the rear end. But in any case, when I did my measurement with my kind of string there, or rope, whatever you want to call it, I could see that I have actually pretty decent clearance, so I don't have to go crazy on that. So if I just go to here, that should be pretty good. But again, each vehicle is going to be a little different. And if you have suspension travel in the back, you got to account for that, because the drive shaft moves up and down with that. Mine doesn't, because it's independent rear suspension. But in any case, each project is a little different. So be flexible as your project goes through, and kind of adapt as you kind of come across new factors. Okay. All right. So next step, I'll just sort of trace out a general template. We'll see what it looks like on here, and then I may just go ahead and cut that out and start shaping it, or might even remove some of this material first, not totally sure. Alright, so I'm developing my template here, and to be able to figure out how much material I need towards the back portion, I can use a flexible ruler like this, and with that straight edge there, it'll show me how high that panel will be there. And then I can just arc this other one around using a reference point, which that hole is the same on both sides. Then I just measure down. It's hard to do that with one hand, but when I did do that, it came out to be around 12.5 inches. Just give me a little extra material. As I start to get the final structure, then I'll be able to trim that if I need to. Alright, so as I was establishing my template, I realized this support's going to actually be in the way. So I'll go ahead and cut that out. I made some lines. You don't have to be super precise on that, since you can basically fill in anything you cut out with your replacement. But in any case, I still think it's best to have reasonably straight and square marks. So I'll go ahead and cut that out, and then we'll go ahead and finalize our template and transition that over to sheet metal. All right, so there's the template where I think it needs to be prior to cutting metal. Now, notice I have some tape on here. It's because I cut a little too much off. So don't shortchange yourself. A good template is really important. So go ahead and add a little extra on. I just fold some tape in on itself, and then that just gives me a little extra real estate to work with, okay? So I'll get that all cut out. Also, kind of just show another technique for making templates, because I was working up here as well. And I just took a piece of scrap construction paper, trying to make that piece that's going to fill in there. And notice if I push over with my finger over that ridge, so it's pushing over this ridge and this ridge, it leaves an indent there. See those indents? So then I can actually use that, cut that out, and then I have my template. And I'll continue the template up this way for 3/4 of an inch for that flange I'm making for the mounting purposes. But that's actually a really easy way, other than kind of cutting and using markers. Now you could just put it on this side, hold it there with tape, or somebody else hold it, and then use a marker on the opposite side. But I find that using that pressing for an indent really useful technique. All right, so now I got my panel all cut out, ready to start shaping it. Now, I have this roll here, which actually works pretty well. But if I didn't have that, what I would try to do is I would find something that's round or cylindrical that has a similar curve to what I'm looking for. And trying to reproduce that tunnel there, probably what I would honestly use is a cylinder like that on its side. Something like that. And then you can just sort of shape it around that. Now, the roll will give me a nice uniform curve, and actually, because it's not totally cylindrical, meaning it's a little larger radius towards the front and a little less in the in the back, so it's kind of conical, what I'll do is I'll tighten one side a little more than the other. So if you want it a little less round, like in the front, you tighten a little less. If you want it more round, meaning a tighter radius, then you go tighter on these here, okay? And you can always bend it back a little straighter if you need to, but I figure it's easier to kind of creep up on the curve you actually want. In addition, it isn't completely cylindrical, right? So we're looking for a curve kind of on the top, and then that curve actually sort of dissipates as you come down to the end of the panel. So most of the roundness will actually be in the middle of the panel. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. All right, so I've made a few marks, one for the center line and then 2 green lines there that represent roughly where the curve of the panel stops. So that way when I'm putting it through the roll, I'm pretty much isolating my pressure with that roll to this area here. And see how it's kind of, it angles out this way, meaning it's going to be conical, okay? All right, so just after using the roll, you can see it actually approximates the shape that I want pretty well, especially up front here. But as you get back here, the curvature isn't quite aggressive enough, okay? So I probably won't use the roll to do that because I really don't want to change it up here. So I'll probably do more hand forming with that, maybe find a cylinder, or just really, honestly, just need to get close. Once I get close though, then I can start making some cuts, kind of like I did under there, where I was able to bend those panels out a little bit. And then I can use my drill with some self-tapping screws to help get it the rest of the way. So it doesn't need to be perfect, just get it kind of close. And then once you start to get close, as you drill holes like that and put those screws in, it'll pull it the rest of the way right where you want it, okay? And then you can start making your final cuts and welding and tacking in place, whatever, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and just form this a little more by hand. Now the nice thing is already having a bit of a curve to it, adding more curve or taking some out is a little bit easier than starting with a flat panel and trying to bend that by hand. You get more likely to actually get a sharp bend and not an actual curve. But now that's already curved, you can see I can actually mold that pretty well. And what I want to do is actually straighten this out just a little bit on the ends as I bend that curve in. So it'll be kind of like that. And you can exaggerate it a little bit if you want to, because if you go too far, as you put it into the tunnel where it's fitting onto, will actually bend it back out where it needs to be. So don't go crazy though, you just small, gentle motions. And we don't want to change it again down at the bottom, so it's just about changing it up at the top here, or at the back side of the portion. All right, but that actually looks pretty decent right there. We'll see how it fits. All right, so the tunnel's actually looking really pretty good. It matches really well up at the front here. And you can see it fits pretty good there. And what I have in mind is, instead of trying to cut it and have it match exactly what I had, I got it screwed in place, and then I'll just use my grinder with the cutoff wheel to cut it while it's on there, and then I'll know everything's going to match up. Now at the back end, I do have a little bit more forming to do. You can see there's just a little extra. I'd either have to curve it a little more by bending it more. The only trouble with doing that is then I may end up with a little bit of extra material here. You can see how it kind of bows out a little bit when you do that. So what I might do is just use my shrinker to kind of take away a little bit of that excess material there, and then I'll actually just form it a little more, meaning just kind of bend it in a little bit more, and we should be able to get that pretty well accommodated. Now the other options would be you could take a couple pie cuts out of here to just shrink that down a little bit. You could also cut here and just expand that out a little bit. So there's different ways you could go about that, but I'll just go ahead and use this device here, which I've shown in other videos. Right now it's set to expand, which would be the opposite I'd want. The shrinkers are here, and then those will actually bring the material together to shrink it, okay? All right, so here's my panel, and I want to take just a little material out of it. Now, this is how the shrinker works. It starts with a little gap, and then as you push down on the pedal down there, it brings those together. So it'll actually shrink. It'll take out a little material. Now, you don't necessarily want to do that too much on the curve, because it will kind of straighten things out, meaning that it's going to flatten that bend a little bit. But we'll just take a little bit out and see how it fits, okay? So just to show you kind of an example, see how it's kind of bowing out a little bit there. If I just so I just go like this, just kind of gentle movements. You don't want to do too much there. But you can see how it leaves those little grooves there. That's showing how it's kind of shrinking that material a little bit. Okay, so I'll just sort of do that all the way around, and then we'll see how it fits. All right, so when you're working with metal, I recommend small changes, and you can always make more as you need to, but you can see how that's already starting to fit quite a bit better. I have just a little bit more either shaping or bending, and we should be able to get that pretty close. Now the other thing too is this panel will actually act as a form. So if you do want to use a hammer, this almost acts like a dolly or a form to kind of shape that piece of metal around. So now that we're getting pretty close, honestly, you could just use some sheet metal screws or a hammer to kind of shape it around that panel. But that said, I got the shrinker. I'll just go ahead and make that just a little bit more graceful in terms of a little bit smoother. And you could even use hammer and dolly to smooth that out, or other machines like the English wheel, or even a planishing hammer, which is like this. But again, don't necessarily need those fancy tools. Hammer and dolly will work fine to kind of smooth things out. And honestly, all that's going to be covered up anyways, so it isn't the end of the world if it isn't perfect. All right, so I fitted it up one last time. It looks pretty good, but you can see that the curve is no longer quite as graceful as it once was. So as mentioned, there's a few ways to kind of smooth that out, but what I chose to do is to use a dolly here. You can just hold that with your hand, which is great, but that said, I got it mounted in a vise, and you can also buy other sets like these. These are from Eastwood, but you can even make your own with the round piece of metal and weld that to some flat stock. But honestly, these are a pretty nice set for relatively inexpensive. But anyways, those are meant to mount in a vise kind of like that, and then just sort of see how that kind of recreates that curve pretty well, and just sort of use that hammer on that dolly to kind of form that, smooth it out a little bit, and we'll have a good looking panel. With a little additional shaping, you can see how much better that actually fits. So there's not, I mean, it really recreates that contour pretty decently. Now it's still just a tiny little ripple there. I'll go ahead and modify that, or kind of refine that in the same way I had improved it already. I'm even using just a hammer to sort of shape around what's already there. And then go ahead and cut one section at a time. I'll probably just cut this section here, weld that, cut another section, weld that, cut another section, weld that, until it's completely welded in. And it should be good to go. Now, keep in mind, even though this looks like clean, fresh metal, you do want to prep that surface before welding. And this has E-coat on it, so you got to grind that E-coating off before you go ahead and try to spot weld that all the way around. Okay? Now I got that panel fitted one last time before I actually start to weld that in place. And I have the edges cleaned up where everything's going to be welded, and I used a flap disc like that to clean that off. Even this new piece of metal, still got to clean that off because it has a coating from the supplier. And you might also notice I actually put a bead in there. It adds a little extra character, but also in addition to that, it actually makes the panel just a little stronger, a little more rigid. Okay. So next step, I'll use my grinder with the cutoff wheel. You can see that's pretty thin. Just run that right across here. Now you cut through both panels, and that's okay too, but I'll just bring it right along the edge here, and that'll give me just the width I need for welding purposes. Okay. And then I'll probably start at the back here, and then I'll start to cut along the bottom and weld all that. And then we should be able to get that panel finalized. All right, now that panel is tacked in place, and I'm going to leave it that way until I get it back on the rotisserie so I can see how the back side looks. And honestly, in some places it, like up in here where it'll be a little bit easier to shape that panel from the back side to get it to meet up perfectly. But anyways, it's great for now. Next step, I'm going to recreate this panel here to go over there. I'm going to recreate that with 18 gauge, which is what it is from the factory, like that. And I'll show you what I have in mind. So I've taken a panel of 18 gauge. This one's just about 5 inches in width, which is perfect because this measures 3 inches across, and those upward sections there and there are just about an inch. But it's got a pretty soft radius. You can see that either of those corners isn't a real sharp bend. So I've actually gone ahead and marked just about where I need. And then I'll take that over to my brake. It's awfully nice if you do have one of these, but you could if you needed to. And I've shown how to do this in other videos, but just take this, pinch that part in a vise, and then pound it down with a hammer. And that actually works pretty decent, but not quite as well as a bending brake like this. This is a magnetic one. But if you want a softer radius, you just go up on these numbers here, and that's about as soft as it gets. And all that does is it moves this part back this way from the kind of pivot point. So that way there's a bigger gap between where it bends and where it holds it down. So that'll give you a softer radius there to more closely approximate what we're trying to recreate. Okay? All right, so here's my panel. Again, trying to kind of recreate that there. But it's also got to go over the transmission tunnel. So what I need to do is put a curve into this. Now, from my perspective, the best way to do that is to use a shrinker. And what the shrinker will do is it will put a radius in here. And see, I've already shown this a few times, but that brings those together and we'll pull the material in, shrinking it, which will add a curve, and we'll see how this actually goes here. And you can see it actually, without much effort, it's already starting to bend. Now, I want to recreate that curve, so I'll do it in a calculated fashion, but that gives an idea of what we're about to do. All right, so there's what that piece looks like after quite a bit of shrinking, a little bit of stretching, a little bit of grinding, and fits pretty well. See, as I kind of push down, it mates along there really pretty well. I'll end up cutting it flush down there. I thought about overlapping it and doing a couple of rosette welds there, but I think still in general it's better not to have overlapping and just do butt joints if you can. But in any case, so I actually thought a couple ways to do this. See, the original equipment has this little strip on the side here, right there. I think I might actually just weld this on first and then go ahead and put a strip on there. Now, do I really have to do that? Maybe not. But that little strip does add surface area for this to mate to this 20 gauge metal. So a little less likely to just tear off there than if it's only welded just to that panel. But and I also did do a few dimple dies on the top. So there was actually a couple reasons for that. I mean, I like doing dimple dies because they look good and they actually add a little strength to the panel. But actually the biggest reason I did in this case is after this is all welded in place, then I can take an undercoating with a wand and get in there, and I can coat all of that surface to keep any of that from rusting, so I can get the whole thing prepped, even get my soundproofing and everything in there. So next step, we'll get that tacked into place, and then we'll make a few strips there and recreate that really pretty well. All right, so I cut a couple 1-inch strips out of 18 gauge metal to make those pieces here, and really just fitting it around the transmission tunnel, I think, is the way to do it. I mean, you can just sort of guess and then bend it, but honestly, even if it's not perfect, it's fine because you can just kind of weld it as you go. But it's nice to have a good length. And then we'll go ahead and punch some holes in there for spot welds. And to do the holes, I'll show you what I'll use. So a few different ways to do this. I mean, just a drill is fine, but that's sort of time consuming and your holes may not be as clean. A hand punch like this, these aren't super expensive, I think on the order of $50-ish, but a much more fancy but also really nice option is a punch like this. Now they do have cheaper punches, like this one's from, I think this was Harbor Freight or Northern, I can't remember which. Not nearly as nice as this Denfix one that comes with all kinds of adapters and has a deeper throat there with multiple heads there. But this is pretty decent if you're looking for something that's more budget. But this will make quick work out of putting those spot weld holes into this panel. So I'll show you how nice and fast this thing works. And the other thing too is when you're doing spot welds, if you want to kind of recreate what the original equipment is, anywhere from around 2.5 to 3 inches between your holes is good. But honestly, even from the factory, they're sort of random sometimes, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And if you're worried about strength, you can always do a few more. All right, so I got this brace into place with, at first with some spot welds to keep it from moving around or warping as I welded, and then I put a few stitch welds in there too. Now, I mean, heat control with this type of panel when you have a brace like that isn't super critical because it's less likely to warp, but I still think it's important not to go too crazy and kind of spread out your heat and maybe even blow some of it off, some compressed air. Now, next step, I'm going to cut these off flush so that way I can do a butt weld there. And then I also took those pieces that I made for the side and I used my bead roller just to kind of make a little, almost like a bevel there that helps to mate it to that bead so I don't have to grind that bead down quite as much. And it should be actually a really, really strong way to attach those two pieces. Now, before I go and weld those in place though, I should clean this metal, make sure it's nice, and then actually use a little bit of weld through primer. Something like that. I really like that one, but there's a bunch of other ones. SEM makes copper weld and stuff like that. And you know, Eastwood has them too. In any case, then coating this area here and that area there, because those are going to be flat against each other, no longer able to access that area to coat it. So a weld-through primer is important there. Also said it before, but you can't actually weld through primer because you need good electrical contact to weld. So you have to actually do something to grind off within those little spot weld areas that weld through primer. So weld through primer is meant for the areas being covered, but not the actual area you're actually welding. Okay, but let's get going with those other steps, and this should be finalized before we know it. Alright, there's that brace all welded in, and it looks pretty decent. I'll go ahead and clean up those welds with a grinder, and then after the grinder I'll use a flap disc just to kind of smooth things out a little bit. Even though it won't show a ton, really at all, but still nice to make your stuff look nice. But really I think it turned out pretty well, and it's going to be super structural. I mean, that is a strong piece right there. I probably want a little bit extra just because that part of the tunnel is just going to be bolt in, which will be pretty strong, but won't be quite as strong if it was welded solid. So just want to be a little extra careful there. And in case of impact, or which would obviously not be very good to get your car all crashed up, but you got to be safe and prepare for that. But let's get those all cleaned up. Then once I get it back on the rotisserie, I'll finish welding all that, and then we'll be able to do a little bit of shaping on the removable panel there, and then put in those nut inserts to help bolt that on and make it look nice and professional. Alright, so here it is with the welds all kind of cleaned up reasonably well. They don't have to be any better than that for this purposes, because it's going to be coated with sound deadening material, and it'll be covered by carpet. But that said, I think actually it looks pretty good. I did want to show one kind of special flap disc that works amazing for cleaning up welds kind of in areas like this that are concave. And these aren't actually that hard to find, but you can see how it's rounded like that. It actually just so perfectly fits right in there. It's just amazing, and it does a good job. You can see without taking too much of the material away on the sides, which is, you don't want to go crazy, you don't want to weaken your actual panel. It makes a nice smooth product there. And actually I usually just get these at Fleet Farm. They're like, I think under $10, and they actually last quite a while because they're flap disc style, meaning as it wears out, more of the grit is exposed. Okay. Now I also did show these dimples, but although I didn't show how to do them in this video, I do have a separate video on dimple dies and how to put those in place. But just think those are pretty great. They add a little bit of extra access there, but also actually stiffen that panel up and make it look kind of nice too. Okay, so next step, we'll get this on the rotisserie. We'll shape just a little bit. So this doesn't match up perfectly. It's pretty good, but if I get on the rotisserie, then I can shape with hammer like that just to get this seam really well lined up. And then I'll finish welding all that in, and we'll move from there. All right, so now I just want to show a way to estimate the trajectory of your drive shaft when you're fabricating a tunnel. So I just used just a regular ruler. It already had some holes in it. That hole is roughly at the 1 inch mark. Now I expect my drive shaft to be somewhere between 3 1/4 and 3.75 inches in diameter. But just to overestimate, I'll just say it's 4 inches, and then so I'll put the center of the drive shaft output. Well, first we'll get that kind of tight. Put the center of that at the 2 inch mark, which would be 3 inches since there's the line is at roughly 1. And then I tied it to the rear end there. And now I can get a general sense with that line tight how much clearance I have. And I have more than enough there. So looks like about 1.5 inches of clearance even at the tightest spot. So that's important to kind of check out before you go and final weld everything. But first you got to pick out your drive shaft, make sure you know what you need. I think I'm going to go with a carbon fiber drive shaft, and 3 1/4 inch actually will support up to about 1,000 horsepower, which is the max I would probably have in this vehicle. Okay, but in any case, one way to do this. All right, there's what it looks like on the bottom now that it's back on the rotisserie. And actually, working from this side might even be a bit easier than being inside of the car. Also, it's either flat or even a little bit convex, which to me makes it easier to clean up that weld after I'm done. This little piece just kind of got extra welded on there. I'll cut that off, trim up a few pieces. We even got a fabricate little piece to go right there, which I already made a template for, and we'll get this going. All right, so I got that weld pretty well finished up. You don't want to go crazy grinding it down though, because you don't want to actually get into neighboring metal or really compromise the strength of that. In addition, the bottom is going to be undercoated, which has a texture, so minor imperfections will be easily covered up. But in any case, looks pretty decent. I might work on it a little more, but moving on to the next step for now is filling these gaps. So I made a template like this, and then cut that out of metal. Again, using 20 gauge like really everything else. I'm going to tack that in place and kind of bend it in to match the contour here. So I did cut away some of that pinch weld, and in a separate video I'm going to show you how I'll modify the firewall to kind of clean it up, but I'll get rid of that entire pinch weld. But I just started here so that way this whole part could bend in to meet where the rest of it is, okay? Alright, so prior to coating, this is what the bottom side looks like. So they actually turned out pretty good, and finish work is pretty decent, especially considering it'll be coated with textured coating, and that should hide almost all those imperfections. But I think it turned out pretty well. Pretty structural. There's the bottom side of that brace there, and you can actually see just a little bit of that bead rolling, how that ends up looking underneath there. All right, but let's get the nut inserts put into place there. We'll finish up the removable panel of the tunnel, and this will be totally complete. All right, so I made a pattern here to use for the bead roller, and most of this will not be seen because the transmission's underneath it, and it'll be covered by carpet, console, etc. But I still think it's nice to do these kinds of things. For structure, it does make this a little more rigid, but also when you do a panel where you really want it to look nice, this is good practice. So anyways, I just made a general pattern, and I actually did it on this side, and I didn't like how that little bulge turned out, so I just used marker, kind of erased that. And to make my radiuses, just use what I had around here. I used a hole saw and then an empty thing of welding wire, and just came up with that. So we'll see how it all looks when I get the beads done, but it should be pretty good looking. All right, so there's how it looks after a few beads in there. Actually, it does make the panel quite a bit more rigid. You can even just feel that just by trying to bend it. But also kind of a neat look, I think. Next thing, I'll go ahead and put that kind of flange on here. I went ahead and marked it from underneath so I know where that is. So that way when it sits in there, it is effectively flush. So it'll offset this a little bit so that way the panel, this part of the panel is flush with the rest of the with the rest of the floor pan. Okay. Now I got the bead roller set up with what I need to kind of create that flange. So, and I also put one extra small washer. You can see that there. That'll just soften that bend just a little bit, because if I didn't have that in there, this edge here would be very close to this one, so it'd be almost a square-like bend. Whereas with pushing that out just a little bit softens that a little bit. So it'll be a little more of a soft bend up on that panel. I'll show you what that looks like on here, but just keep in mind, even with the same die, changing around the orientation with spacers can actually change how the bend turns out, okay? Because it's that space. Bring that together. See, there's a little bit of extra space right in there than there would be if I didn't have that washer in there. And I could put different size washers in there and kind of orient things a little bit differently. All right, next step is to go about getting this panel fastened into the tunnel. And instead of welding that in place, like I mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and make it so I can bolt that in. Now, they have these rivet nut inserts that can be used, which are really great, because when the transmission's in there, it's going to be pretty hard to access the backside of that panel. So, these are perfect, because you don't have to hold anything in place. It's already held there. Now the tool that's used to do that is this rivet nut gun here. It looks a lot like a rivet gun. That one's made by Astro. It does come with additional accessories to be able to allow it to adapt to other size nut inserts like this. And you can see there's assortment. These are all galvanized. These are pretty good ones here. And then you use the corresponding thread size there. Okay. Now, pretty easy tool to use, just like any other air tool. Nice to lubricate it every once in a while with air tool oil. And then go ahead and drill the corresponding size for the hole. You don't want that too big though. You want it just big enough. You don't want it to be wobbling in there. So here's the right size of that, and you can see it just sort of fits right inside there. Now after you drill, there's sometimes just a little bit of metal left over there. Use a flap disc or grinder, just make sure you get that cleaned up. And then pretty easy, this just kind of screws on there like that. This little wheel back here also rotates that, okay? So that's the way to get that off once it's inserted, but see how easy this thing operates. It's just kind of right in there like that. You can see it's not too big. And then just to press that trigger a few times. All right, and the back side, you can see how it actually starts to shrink it on the opposite side, which is what holds that in place, okay? And then when you're all done, you can go ahead and rotate this off to free that the tool from the actual insert there. So pretty great tool. Go ahead and get these in there for the rest of the way and have that panel affixed. All right, so I'm getting ready to drill the holes to hold the transmission tunnel panel to the transmission tunnel. And what I did is I left some of those kind of pilot holes where it was held in place with the self-tapping screws. That way I could keep it in alignment. And then I marked through the drilled holes in the tunnel onto the panel with the paint marker. See that? And then I used a small drill bit to drill right in the center of that. That way I can check my alignment again and just make sure that some nail or a screw or a drill bit, whatever, comes through there and aligns with the rivet nut, because even being off a little bit there can mess up your panel. So you want those pretty close, and it's pretty easy to not quite get that right. So anyways, that was my method of getting that done, and got all these drilled. Then once I have everything matched up, I'll put the rest of those rivet nuts in there. And this is all doubled up here, as we kind of saw earlier with another piece of 18 gauge. I didn't do that here on the front part, so that's purely just one sheet of 20 gauge. So I may actually tack those rivet nuts in place with the welder. Just be careful, those rivet nuts are galvanized, which means that you need to grind that galvanized coating off and then make sure that you have a good respirator while you're welding, because welding galvanized metal creates toxic fumes, okay? In any case, well, let's see how this moves forward. All right, with the panel mounted up, you can see how the paint marker marks are there. And then the drill bit hole lines up pretty well. Now I should also note that when I first mounted this up, you can see that kind of offset there. See how it's actually almost perfectly flush because I used the roller to offset that. Now I wasn't quite on here. I had to remark my line, and then I just used the bead roller on it again. So just keep in mind, if you screw up with your bead roller, you can always kind of flatten things out and start over again. It's not too big of a deal. So you don't have to be perfect. But starting to look pretty good here. So all those pretty well lined up. All right, so there the transmission tunnel is complete. And you can see the cover there. It has all the fasteners in place. And I actually like how it turned out, where I put a little lip on here so it's actually flush on the bottom. So it almost looks like one piece from the bottom. But in my mind, it looks like maybe the factory meant it to be that way, yet it's a kind of cool feature. And it flows seamlessly into the rest of the car with a little bit of beadwork there for both strength and a little bit of design. Okay. Now the bottom side actually looks pretty good too. So the top side's not coated yet, but the bottom is. I did do a separate video on how I achieved that appearance is pretty strong undercoating. But you can see how, I think that looks really nice. It blends into the rest of the vehicle. Should be very functional, yet really nice form overall. But thanks for checking out the video. Let me know if you got other projects, ideas, things you thought of when watching this video. Appreciate you checking it out.